Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant issue, something that's definitely making waves, especially if you're keeping track of current socio-political developments for the UPSC exams. We're going to delve into the complexities that come up when feminist ideas become more, well, mainstream in India, particularly thinking about things like the recent Women's Reservation Bill, 2023.
That's right. And by mainstreaming, we're talking about how feminist perspectives are just much more visible now in public debates, in policy talks, even, in our daily lives.
Exactly, which sounds positive on the surface, right?
It is in many ways. It's a landmark development. But as our source for today, a really insightful piece from The Hindu points out, this increased visibility has created a kind of paradox.
A paradox. How so?
Well, our mission today is to really unpack that. Why does it seem that sometimes the more awareness there is, the more fraught or complicated the engagement becomes?
Okay, I see. So more talk doesn't automatically mean easier conversations.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And for anyone preparing for the UPSC, especially GS Paper IN2, getting your head around these deeper layers of social change, these gender dynamics, it's absolutely crucial.
Couldn't agree more. So we're not just scratching the surface. We need to explore the nuances. The source mentioned some key themes, right?
Yes. We'll look at how the big picture structural stuff interacts with, personal relationships.
Right.
We'll also talk about the challenges of applying maybe universal feminist ideas across such a diverse country like India.
Right. Context matters hugely.
Hugely. And also, importantly, thinking about men's roles and even their vulnerabilities within this whole picture. And finally, the need for what the source calls a more compassionate approach.
A compassionate feminism.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, let's start right there. With this paradox of mainstreaming, what's the core issue?
Well, it's fascinating because you'd think, okay, gender issues are more prominent, so dialogue should be easier, more productive.
That makes intuitive sense, yeah.
But the source suggests that the sheer pervasiveness, the kind of saturation of feminist discourse now, can sometimes put up barriers. It can start to feel a bit rigid, perhaps, polarized even.
And disconnected.
Yes, disconnected from the, let's say, the messiness, the emotional complexity of how people actually live their lives.
That really resonates. It's like the volume goes up, but the ability to hear the subtlety sometimes goes down.
Yeah.
So the source then tries to break it down, talking about two terrains of feminism. I found that helpful.
Yes, that's a really useful distinction it makes. The first terrain is the structural. This is the traditional and very powerful focus of feminist analysis.
So we're talking about the big systems.
Exactly. The overarching frameworks in society, political representation, economic opportunity, access to education, basic safety, all those things that have historically put women at a disadvantage, institutional stuff.
Right. Obvious examples are things like needing more women in parliament or tackling the gender pay gap. Those are clear structural issues.
Absolutely. That's where a lot of feminist energy has, quite rightly, been directed. But then, the source says, there's the second terrain, the interpersonal.
Okay, so moving from the system to the personal.
Precisely. This is about our relationships, partners, family, friends, the dynamics within the home, our daily interactions.
And the source argues these are connected, but distinct.
Yes, interconnected, definitely. But the article warns against sort of mechanically applying those broad structural critiques directly onto interpersonal situations without understanding the specific context, the nuances.
Okay, this is where it gets really complex, doesn't it? Because the article brings up an example, expectations around housework in Indian homes, but alongside that, the sacrifices men might make, like tough jobs or being the main breadwinner.
It does, and it's crucial to understand the point here. The source isn't trying to excuse patriarchy or say systemic issues don't matter. Not at all.
Right. It's not making excuses.
No. What it's doing is highlighting that within these structures, there's often a complex web of, care, duty, mutual dependence, emotional ties. Things aren't always black and white in lived experience.
So it adds layers to the picture, which links to how change actually happens, right?
Right.
It's not just laws changing. The source talks about structural change and everyday negotiations.
Exactly that. The big systemic reforms protests, legislation like the Women's Reservation Bill, policy shifts, they're absolutely vital, indispensable, really.
But not the whole story.
Not the whole story. The article makes a really sharp point that real, lasting change also bubbles up from below through countless small, everyday adjustments, micro-level stuff.
Like what, for example?
Well, the source gives examples like a father deciding, maybe against tradition, to send his daughter to college, or a husband adjusting his own life and expectations because his wife has a demanding career, or even whole families, maybe in marginalized communities, starting to rethink who does what.
And this is where the idea of men as quiet allies comes in. That caught my attention.
It's a really interesting concept. The point is that progress doesn't only come from people who explicitly call themselves feminists. Many men contribute through their actions, their support in daily life, even if they don't use the label.
So acknowledging that contribution.
Acknowledging it, the source suggests, doesn't weaken feminism. It actually gives us a broader view of how change happens and might even strengthen the movement by recognizing a wider range of allies.
But, and this is a big but, the source is also very clear we can't ignore the really harsh realities, right? The clear and egregious instances
Yeah.
of violence and suppression.
Absolutely non-negotiable. Things like honor killings or women being used as political proxies. These are stark reminders that we still need incredibly strong institutional responses and deep cultural shifts.
So the state's role in justice and protection is paramount there.
Indispensable. The overall argument is that effective, sustainable feminist work has to happen on both levels. The big institutional changes and the societal interpersonal shifts, and always, always with sensitivity to context and the sheer diversity of experiences across India. That's a crucial takeaway for UPSC aspirants understanding this multi-pronged nature of social reform.
Which leads perfectly into what the source calls the danger of collapsing contexts. That seems like a major challenge today.
It really is. It's a central concern in the article. This tendency, sometimes seen in current feminist discussions, to treat vastly different experiences as if they're all part of one single story.
Homogenizing things.
Exactly. The source uses a striking contrast. Think about the challenges an urban, educated, financially independent woman faces perhaps workplace discrimination, juggling career and home. Now compare that to the reality for many rural women who might lack basic physical safety or autonomy over their own lives. These are profoundly different struggles.
Right, and lumping them together under one umbrella.
Risks misrepresenting reality, the source argues. But it also risks alienating people, maybe potential allies, particularly men who might be facing their own struggles and vulnerabilities that don't fit neatly into a simple narrative of privilege.
That's a really tough point. The article mentions men facing pressures too, maybe economic hardship, public shame.
It does. It gives that example of a man with lower earnings facing public humiliation, perhaps in his community, and contrasts that with a woman maybe doing unpaid labor at home, but shielded from that specific kind of public indignity. It's not saying one is worse, but that the experiences of disadvantage and privilege are complex, they intersect in complicated ways.
It really forces you to think beyond simple binaries, doesn't it?
It does. And acknowledging this complexity, the source suggests, is vital if we want to build solidarity rather than just defensiveness.
So this points towards the solution offered, towards a compassionate feminism. What does that actually mean in practice? It sounds softer, maybe.
The article is careful to say it's not about weakening core principles. It's not about compromising on equality or justice.
Okay, so not backing down on fundamentals.
Not at all. It's framed more as a strategic and maybe ethical adjustment, especially given how polarized and antagonistic public discourse can be these days. For UPSC aspirants, seeing this as a strategic approach to social change is quite useful.
So strategically, what does compassionate involve?
It involves, according to the source, developing a feminist lens that can actually see and acknowledge the pressures, emotional, economic, that men might face, especially marginalized men.
Why? What's the goal there?
The hope is that by showing some empathy, some understanding of those pressures, you might foster support, build bridges, rather than immediately creating opposition. It's about having a feminism that can hold contradictions, that can see complexity without becoming complicit in injustice. That's the tightrope walk.
That sounds incredibly difficult. Holding contradictions without being complicit.
It is difficult. It requires real nuance, being able to distinguish clearly between systemic injustice, which needs direct confrontation, and the messy realities of personal relationships, where context and culture really matter.
And seeing men not just as obstacles.
Exactly. Seeing them not only as potential upholders of patriarchy, but also as potential partners in building something better. The core idea is that a feminism grounded more in understanding and empathy, rather than solely blame, might actually be more powerful in changing society for the long haul.
And the source brings it back to relationships at the end, reminding us the personal is political. That classic feminist idea.
Absolutely central, yes. That insight remains fundamental. But the article adds a layer. It suggests that while sometimes you might need an adversarial stance.
Sometimes confrontation is necessary.
Definitely. But maybe it shouldn't be the default setting for every interaction. It floats the idea that a feminism built on solidarity, maybe a bit of humility and genuine care could be more potent, more sustainable.
So the end goal isn't just tearing down patriarchy, but actually reimagining our relationships, personal and political, to be equitable, respectful, and, well, deeply human. That's quite profound.
It really is. So, just to quickly wrap up the key takeaways for our listeners, especially those deep in UPSC prep, we've looked at this tricky paradox of feminism going mainstream. We've talked about separating structural issues from interpersonal ones while seeing how they connect.
Right, and the danger of flattening diverse experiences into one narrative.
Crucially, plus the importance of acknowledging the full picture, including men's experiences and vulnerabilities within these same systems.
Mm.
And finally, this idea of exploring a more compassionate, empathetic approach.
And thinking about these complexities is so important for UPSC analysis. It moves beyond surface-level takes and really enriches your understanding, which will definitely show in your answers.
Absolutely. Which leads us to a final thought for you to ponder, building on the source. How can our individual actions, our daily interactions, actually contribute to the larger goal of gender equality in a way that builds bridges, fosters real understanding, and encourages partnership across genders?
That's a great question to reflect on. It brings it right back to our own lives and choices. Okay, well, if you found this deep dive into this topic, drawing from the Hindu, useful for your UPSC journey, please do give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and definitely leave a comment. Let us know your thoughts, your questions.
Yeah, your feedback really helps us figure out what deep dives are most helpful for your preparation.
Thanks for tuning in.